Hi everyone, Carmen here, Managing Digital Editor at Ms. I am back at the National Sexual Assault Conference and I'm talking to Holly Rider-Milkovich, I want to get everyone's name right, and Elizabeth Bille from EVERFI, and they're Senior Directors of Prevention and Harassment Prevention. And yeah, I mean, there's so much to dig into. I know. Yes. I wanted to sort of start with the workshop that you guys are doing, which is on preventing sexual harassment and violence in the workplace and sort of revolutionizing the approach there. And what do you think fundamentally has to change about the way we approach these sorts of issues in the workplace?
I'll take a pass at that to start. Thank you, but then I'd love Holly to chime in too. Essentially, what we've seen as a result of the Me Too movement is a real realization that the traditional approaches that have been used in the past just simply weren't effective. And those approaches were really sort of scattershot, discrete, isolated activities that were primarily reactive, response-based. So I like to use a safety metaphor here that employers really focused on implementing first aid after someone had been harmed, but not really focused on preventing the injury in the first place. So what we are advocating is that employers should take a more strategic and preventative approach. They really need to zoom up and think about all of the activities across the organization and how they can support their efforts to prevent violence, and also to take a more preventative approach, focusing on culture rather than risk management.
Totally.
You know, the piece that I would add as it relates to higher education is that there's this extraordinary opportunity for faculty and staff to create that strong backbone foundation of prevention and of expertise that our incoming and our ongoing students can really benefit from. But what we see oftentimes is the flip. Our community members, who are the most likely to be transient, are the ones who are getting the most education. And for us, we see a real opportunity to create a community-wide commitment to making sure that every faculty member, staff member, and student has the skills and the knowledge and the expertise to be able to support their community, interrupt situations of harm when they see it, and connect those to resources.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, you know, what efforts to prevent campus sexual violence and efforts to prevent violence in the workplace have in common is like these are institutional changes, right, that have to happen. And I was thinking about that a lot today when we were talking about accountability in the frame of this corporate lens of what Uber is trying to do, and that kind of stuff is totally important. And what Time's Up is doing to sort of open up the doors is really important. But you're right? Like it's not just about holding people accountable, because that sort of takes for granted that something's going to go wrong in the first place. So what does that shift look like? Like, what is an actual sort of prevention strategy that is focused on making sure it stops happening versus focusing on just knowing what's going to happen after it happens?
You know, I want to hone in on exactly what you just said around like the institutional approach, because at EVERFI, we think that institutionalization, the way in which senior leaders commit to this issue and do so in a visible and public way, like we saw Tony West do this morning, with his amazing, conversation as a part of the panel, is what needs to happen. And this is also true for higher education. That's one really important part of it. And there's this incredible work coming out of Stanford University that researches the power of senior leaders' voices in addressing these issues, and that ability to transform campuses and to transform workplace cultures and to causally create change. So any senior leader out there who is not using their voice to talk about these issues and to express their commitment and their institution and their organization's commitment is leaving a tool in the toolbox that has now been demonstrated to create change. And I know you have more to say about it.
That was wonderful. I think I would simply add something else to that, is that one of the things that we are hoping that leaders will do using that platform that they have, using their influence as leaders, is to demonstrate a true and authentic desire to know about what is actually happening on their campuses or in their workplaces. That until we have are in a place where people feel like that the leaders want to hear from them when things aren't going well, that their complaints will be taken seriously, or maybe not even a complaint, just a concern. They're seeing warning signs of something brewing. Unless that we cultivate that culture of that speak up culture and that authentic desire to know, we won't be able to resolve these issues until they become a full blown crisis. And by then it's too late. You've got legal ramifications, you've got culture damage, and the like. I think the other area where we can do some more work, and this will also help with prevention, is being more transparent in how we're holding people accountable as well. We've seen some universities do some really exciting work in this area.
I wanted to put up a hallelujah hand there.
Do you want to go on?
No, I'm behind you.
Yes, okay, great.
We're just your cheering section
All
over
right.
here.
So, and really sharing very candidly about what kind of complaints are coming in, how they're being handled, and the outcomes of those. And that has the most incredible effect of building trust in the system, of demonstrating accountability, and therefore reducing events from happening, because people know that if they go astray, they will be held accountable.
Yeah, and it just closes that gap of, I make a report, and then the institution or the organization might be doing an incredible job in, taking that issue seriously and investigating it in a thorough and fair way, applying accountability measures that are appropriate to the thing. And if it's not shared back with the person who, who first reported the harm, the perspective is, I reported and my institution or my organization did nothing. So we have such opportunity to even highlight the extraordinary work that many organizations and institutions are already doing and use that to build trust.
Yeah. Well, and I also think, we had sort of after the Me Too explosion, we've had a lot of people reach out to Ms. and want to publish their own stories, right?
Yeah.
Of maybe reporting or what it was like for them to battle discrimination and harassment. And we did hear from a lot of academics about how complicated it is, right? To feel like you have that voice to speak up in academia, especially if you're not tenured, especially if the other person is tenured. And when I was thinking about talking to you both today and sort of this idea of revolutionizing how we approach this in the workforce, it made me think too about, we're seeing that Me Too is having ramifications in all of these very unique industries. Hollywood is a very unique industry. Fast food and low wage workers have their own very unique battle to fight. And like education is such a unique system. What are the sort of things that every workplace can do and put in place that sort of make sure that we're moving beyond that breakthrough of just feeling like people can come forward, but also people feeling like they're safe at work?
Well, I think we just touched on one of them, which is increasing transparency about your processes, about the multiple ways that you can report, and what you're doing proactively to prevent or address harassment. Another really promising strategy that we've seen in empirical research has borne this out, and our work at EVERFI has borne this out as well, is giving every employee, faculty, staff, leader bystander intervention training. We just, it is critical that when we see warning signs of harm, that people feel empowered to take action immediately, to either speak up or to report it after the fact, whatever feels safe to them or what they feel equipped to do in the moment. It is so critical that everyone in the institution or everyone in the organization know that they can be a part of the solution, and in fact they have a responsibility as sort of guardians of our workplace culture, wherever that workplace may be, to play a role in that. And so equipping our employees, our faculty and staff with the tools and skills of what can they do if they see something that's concerning? What can they say in a way that's comfortable to them, in a way that's suitable for their role in the organization or maybe their personality, and using that as such a powerful lever to create change and to create safe spaces in the workplace. Anything else that you'd add?
Oh, no. I think that both of those pieces are really important, and they really can translate to any industry, to any kind of a work environment. We have challenges. We have dispersed work environments. We have folks working around the clock. We have bargain for employees. And so we know that there isn't one solution that's going to fit everybody. But I think thinking about those critical foundations of how are senior leaders messaging the importance of this issue? How are we providing the tools that every employee needs in order to be able to notice when situations of harm are happening and be able to report them? How are we measuring that that's successful? And how are we reporting that back out to our community? Because we want for our communities to know that change is possible, we're a part of the solution, and this is the progress that we're making as a community. Without that positive feedback, we might fall into the trap that says that, this is an issue that is intractable. It is tragic, but inevitable. And that is absolutely a perspective that is wrong, and then we all have to do our part to smash them to bits.
Yeah, well, and that also gets me thinking, and this was something I was asking the folks from the opening plenary about too when I talked to them earlier, was what is the ripple effect, right? Like, what is the outward reverberation from a workplace when that workplace culture fundamentally has to shift away from being a workplace where violence and harassment are seen as inevitable or hazards in the workplace that everyone deals with. Like what's the culture shift that happens when the workplace culture shifts?
I'll defer to you to take first pass.
Oh, absolutely. Oh no, I mean, so the reverberations. The first one is increased productivity. Like, you get folks who are happier in the workplace, and they are able to collaborate more effectively with each other. They stay longer. They are able to problem solve more effectively. They take less personal time or other time away. So like, all of the positive, like all of the ripples are positive. I mean, it's, you get, increased retention, increased productivity, increased, satisfaction of the workforce. And we know how important it is to have a productive and happy and satisfied workforce. Hey, you know what the other thing is? You're more likely to have a more diverse workforce as well.
Yeah.
And that has its own incredibly positive, ripples. So it's like doing this difficult and essential work just gives us benefits. It just gives us benefits. The downsides
Of doing this work?
It's like, well, let me just be honest. I think that there's a downside of taking a leap into doing something differently, into having the anxiety about potentially some information that changes how you thought about the way in which your workplace was structured. And so that can be a part of it too. But that, I think, is the place that we need to get through as we're moving towards all of that positive, place of the future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it's also sort of, you said this, Tina said this idea that we obviously have learned that some of the strategies we've been putting in place over the last few decades haven't really been panning out, since sexual harassment remains, just as much an epidemic today as it was when we put it on the cover of Ms. in the 70s. And I'm sort of curious to, like, what do you think, having done this work, having thought so critically about workplaces, about institutions of higher ed, what is the problem at the root in the workplace, you think, that enables these cultures of violence and harassment? Like, what about work do we have to sort of dismantle and change on that larger scale?
That's such a good question.
Fantastic question. And I have many ideas swirling in my head, many answers. I think at the root of it is several different dynamics. One is power disparity, and the ramifications of that, whether it's just power disparities that are gendered, power disparities that are also immigration status, power disparities that are based on a whole host of things. When you have those kinds of power disparities, it can lead to exploitation, it can lead to abuse, and that I think not left unchecked. And so, but I mean, we find that one of the organizational risk factors for harassment or violence occurring in the workplace is places where there are significant disparities in power between those the haves and have-nots, if you will. So if we can address sort of power differentials and empower people to have a voice, to know that they are critical contributors to the workforce, just as the rainmaker is, just as the superstar employee is, that will go a long way. I think another situation is that employers need to really get comfortable with taking action, especially when the harasser may be someone who has a lot of social and political capital or who is economically a superstar in the organization. So we've heard time and time again in the Me Too movement that I complained about this person, but of course it's the superstar, and so nothing happened. Those are exactly the people that we need to be taking these complaints very seriously about, and indeed being very transparent about how we handle them. And when you do that, then it has a tremendous impact on the trust and the experience of the entire organization. Thank you. Those are a couple of thoughts. Holly, do you want to add anything?
Yeah. I totally agree with everything you said. And in higher ed, there's this amazing National Academies report that came out in the summer of last year, and it identified so many of the things that you're talking about, Elizabeth, as it relates to those power differentiators, the way in which the superstar can sometimes be a magnet for harassment, discrimination, but also someone who people are really loath to report, and all of the ways in which we can seek to dismantle and close up some of those power gaps. Look carefully at ways in which an individual might have sole or oversized focus on another person's ability to impact another person's career. That's something that you want to look at very, very carefully, and definitely translates to higher ed as well. So I'm so glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, and then, I mean, what are some of the models for success that you all have seen out there? Like, what are the workplaces that are getting it right, the colleges that are getting it right, I don't know, who's getting it right, and what can folks learn from them who maybe have the power to institute those kinds of changes, but then also maybe the folks at home who want to agitate for those changes? Like, how were they won? How were they pushed into place?
Do you have any thoughts here, or some general best practices that you've seen that may not be attached to any one particular workplace?
Sure. I think I'll highlight a couple of really exciting practices on the transparency front. I really can't stress enough. I think transparency about the problem, do we have a problem, and how are we handling it, is really a critical sort of table stakes next step for organizations. And we're seeing a lot of promising practices both in higher ed and in the corporate sector as well. There was a study by an organization called EVERFI that asked a number of leading corporations who they had identified as the world's most ethical companies, to what extent are they sharing their experiences about harassment and discrimination in the workplace, in terms of complaints, in terms of how they were handled, how much are they disclosing that? And 6% of these companies are actually producing a standalone report, divorced from any other kind of report that they may have to do, solely about complaints and how they're handled and what the outcomes were. The redacted of individually identifying information, but to demonstrate that commitment to accountability on these issues. Another significant percentage, I think 26 or 28%, are including that in their annual reports that they're producing publicly. So, so we're seeing a lot of movement of organizations willing to put a stake in the ground and say, we're working on this. It happens here too, but we take it very seriously, and here's how we take it seriously.
And what I talked about earlier, I think that those colleges and universities who have made this commitment to their community and the students they serve to actually ensure that every member of their community receives appropriate education, and that they're actually testing the rigor of that education. If that is the best practice that we're starting to see at some of our institutions that have made that senior external commitment to take these issues very seriously, and also to address shortfallings when they occur. We saw a really beautiful example of this from the University of Chicago, that a woman who had decades earlier left her PhD program because of serial harassment. University of Chicago's president said, this is not right, and we have the opportunity to make it right, and supported that student, Marilyn Webb, a luminary in our field, to go through the process and actually have the opportunity to finish that degree, to make right what happened to that person. So I think that being willing to be public in the making right also is a really important part of that next step.
Yeah, well, and that actually makes me think too about when we talk about like what's the risk and what's scary. which is something that came up earlier this morning, and I feel like it came up today when we were talking, and this idea that I do think that for a lot of institutions, that is the risk, right? I remember when I was in college working on these kinds of issues, the line of thought was always, well, no college wants to find out how many sexual assaults happen on campus, because then they have to put it in their security report, and when parents visit the school in like June, they're going to see the security report and they're not going to want to send their kids there because they're going to be like the one school that actually has an accurate count and everyone else says 0 or 1 or 2. So what would you say, like, what have you seen from, like, when folks are transparent, do their communities come around and support them in those efforts, or does it sometimes, you know, like, is that not as big a cost as folks might be afraid it is?
You know, I wonder if this is a place where higher ed might be moving a little bit faster than the corporate world, in that, you know, our higher ed consumers are becoming more and more savvy around, you know, what it means when an institution is being transparent about the issues that are happening on their campus and how they're seeking to both prevent them and to address them. That is actually, you know, a positive sign of a healthy culture and a place where you may want to seriously consider sending your child. You know, but that's been a journey. Yeah, you know, that's really been a journey, and so I think that. I'm excited about the ways in which the corporate world seems to also be following that journey, and I don't know if you have other things to say about that.
Sure. I think there is starting to be a shift in how we think about risk in these particular issues. Traditionally, corporations used to think about risk in terms of legal exposure or brand damage in particular. So those kinds of reports or finding out about incidents that had happened would be very uncomfortable for the organization to have a sort of a candid examination of. But I also think that this is exactly where the bystander intervention and taking preventative measures really comes into play, because if we can convince leaders, if we can convince corporations that if you invest in your work to engage your entire organization in the effort of spotting warning signs, and then you take those warning signs seriously, those reports about warning signs seriously before they've escalated into an assault in harassment, you've mitigated the problem. Then you won't have to worry about whatever exposure may come from that ultimate end event. And if and when it does occur, because it can always happen, notwithstanding best efforts, you can demonstrate being to a swift and appropriate and proportionate action that will go an incredibly long way in preserving culture, and your employees will understand.
Yeah, well, and as to like infiltrators who work directly inside these communities and help empower folks to be better, what would be your advice for some of the activists and advocates who might not know how to engage with corporate partners or with institutions like higher ed institutions, of sort of how to speak to them in their language and get them to do that critical buy-in?
Uh-huh.
I'll just start a little bit.
We've thought about this.
I've thought a lot about it. Absolutely. Well, meeting corporations where they are and understanding sort of what are their pain points regarding their views of risk, for example, really making the business case in business terms of the costs of this issue, the costs of not acting, the costs of not doing something different. Ali cited some amazing statistics earlier about turnover, increased turnover, productivity going down, not just the productivity of the one person who experiences harassment, but their entire team who witnesses harassment. There's a lot of data about how it impacts engagement, absenteeism, health plan costs. All of these really go to the bottom line. And if you present those to a senior executive in an organization, those are data points that will catch their attention. So, Holly.
Yeah, absolutely. And connecting this work to the mission and those mission critical priorities. So in higher ed, relating it to retention, relating it to those important diversity and inclusion metrics that campuses are looking for. Certainly relating it to ensuring that the funds that are coming from the state are being used in an effective way. All of those pieces, that regulatory oversight, all of those components are a part of fulfilling that mission and hitting those pain points that you talked about, Elizabeth. So I would say the same for higher ed as well. Really need to make a mission-focused business case.
Awesome. All right. Well, And I think those are all the questions I had for you, but thank you so much. This was awesome.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure.
Yes.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much, Carmen.
Thanks. And I'll be back later, guys.
Bye.
Bye.